You're listening to a podcast from the Today programme on BBC Radio 4.
2 people arrested by Wiltshire Police in connection with allegations of sexual abuse by the former Prime Minister Sir Edward Heath have been told they will face no further action. The investigation, however, remains active. It was launched in 2015 in dramatic fashion. Superintendent Sean Memory standing outside Sir Edward's former home in Salisbury, appealing for information.
This allegation was brought to us earlier on this year. We've worked tirelessly to try and establish whether there's any foundation to it. But again, as I stress, this is about pulling forward witnesses and victims, have some trust in Wiltshire Police that will deal with it effectively, with absolute privacy for those that come forward. But I would urge those people that have information or that have been victims of crime to come forward to us today.
The force now says that its complex and multi-stranded investigation is ongoing. Early on, the criminologist Dr. Richard Hoskins became involved, called in by Wiltshire Police.
I've investigated something like nearly 200 criminal investigations over the last 15 years, and so I've developed an expertise in the area of ritual crime. So I'm well known for working in this area, and Wiltshire Police found that they thought there were elements of ritualistic crime within this inquiry.
And what did you find when you started looking into the evidence available?
Well, I was presented with 2 large dossiers, one on the Wiltshire Police investigation and the other on the historic Westminster VIP paedophile inquiry. The reason that I had both dossiers is because there are overlaps and people named in one inquiry were named in another. And as I looked into it, I found a series of very questionable evidence. So I began to probe into that. I approached the whole thing with an open mind, as I always do, but I began to find that the evidence didn't look strong to me.
Why not?
Well, there were issues here about how the evidence had come to light in the first place. And as with the Westminster VIP paedophile inquiry, where we know it all went back to one sole source, Nick, there was an issue here about the way that the evidence on the Wiltshire inquiry went back to effectively a sole source who had recovered memories from the 1980s. So this immediately led to me making valid comparisons with the 1980s satanic ritual abuse panic.
Just explain what recovered memories are.
OK, well, this is where people who have gone through trauma regain memory that they have blocked out. And that's a genuine thing. It does happen. The trouble is the role of some psychotherapists, and we have to say some here, especially under hypnosis, as happened in this case, leads to questions when we're dealing with criminal cases.
And you thought that meant this was not credible, the evidence before you?
I am certain the evidence was not credible with which I was presented, because there were serious question marks, which I can't go into all the details here because some parts of the report remain confidential. But there were serious question marks about the way the memories were recovered. But in itself, the evidence was fantastical. I counted, I think, 21 murders, apparently, that had taken place, some of which involved Edward Heath, in broad daylight in English churchyards, on English church altars. There were sensational accounts of ritual orgies and drinking blood and such like. And I do think that, just as which happened with Nick on the Westminster inquiry, had people just taken a step back and said, hang on a second, is this really likely? They might have stopped and paused the investigation at that point.
And you told Wiltshire Police this?
I did. I produced a 160-page report after 2 months of very solid work. As I always do, approached the case with a very open mind. I tackled all the evidence, but my conclusions were pretty damning, and that did not go down well with Wiltshire Police.
What did they say?
Well, the response initially and this is after I've produced something like 200 case reports over 15 years, was something I've never encountered before, which was that I apparently was questioning the credibility of witnesses. Well, yes, I was, effectively, but of course that was never my aim. I mean, I myself am a victim of historic sexual abuse, so somebody got 10 years for it, so I have no axe to grind at all, quite the opposite. But we're dealing here with evidence, and if the evidence looks sketchy, then we have to ask the questions, and I did. Wiltshire Police were uncomfortable with that. They did not take my recommendations forward, which were to submit the reports. I was not asking to go public. I suggested that the report should go to the chair of the Historic Abuse Inquiry, the Home Affairs Select Committee, the chair of the IPCC and the Metropolitan Police Chief Commissioner. These were not outlandish recommendations at all. I felt that those stakeholders in the public interest must know about this.
And the police say that what they put before you, the evidence which you decided was not credible, was only a small part of what they had.
Well, I'm afraid that the Wiltshire Police are wriggling at every single turn here. And whenever one part of their investigation falls down, this is their fallback. They're saying that no, but there's another strand. And so now we have a situation where 2 witnesses have been cleared. And again, they're going to say, well, that was only one strand. The fact is, and I had this briefing with the police before we started, I was briefed on all the different strands of the investigation. This was the core strand that they wanted to use to prove Ted Heath's guilt.
But it's not impossible that there are other strands, and they are, as recently as yesterday, sticking to the fact that they believe all of this is worth investigating. They say this remains a live and ongoing investigation with a significant number of allegations made by a number of separate individuals.
Well, the police have been on a fishing trip with this. They, I think, outrageously stood outside Ted Heath's house and called basically for people to come forward. Now, of course, there's a balance here. We know that with historic cases, we do need to get people to come forward if there's genuine case of abuse. But they have been on a fishing trip. Some of it has clearly been quite absurd. And the investigation so far has cost, up to the end of last month, £1,142,000. This is not, I think, for the police to decide now whether this goes forward. I think in the public interest, somebody has got to say it's time to call a halt to this. There's no credible evidence. Nothing has stuck on Ted Heath. And that was the point of this investigation.
They've had 2 years, which is not as long as other investigations have been given.
It's still a hell of a long time with 21 officers involved working on a case in which they have found so far not one single scrap of hard evidence.
Why did you go public with all of this? Because by doing so, you went against the agreement that you signed, and you won't be able to do future work like this for police forces.
Well, that's a decision that I myself have taken. In fact, actually, individual police forces are still approaching me because they seem to appreciate the work I've done previously. But as a member of the National...
Have you not been removed from the National Crime Agency list of approved experts?
I took myself off the National Crime Agency database of experts. That was my decision because I was so... appalled, frankly, by the response of Wiltshire Police to a report that was a serious piece of academic research. I was not asking to go public. I was asking it should go to the various agencies who deserve to see this information. In fact, the Historic Abuse Inquiry have called for my report and they have now received it.
You're very convinced that there is nothing to be found in relation to these allegations. How can you be so sure that there aren't people out there who need to be brought to justice for something that happened?
Well, there is a balance here. And obviously, we don't want to go back to the situation with Jimmy Savile where things were covered up. But I think there is a balance. And if after 2 years of investigating, nothing solid has been found, and my understanding is that there is nothing solid on Ted Heath, then for the sake of his reputation, and don't forget other people have been besmirched in this process, like Lord Britton, who went to the grave never knowing his name was cleared. And with the extent of public money being spent, then someone has to draw a line. Now, of course, if there are genuine strands and there are real people who have been through the trauma of abuse, which I know all about, then that must, of course, be investigated. But this is totally disproportionate. That's the problem here.
The criminologist Dr. Richard Hoskins. Well, in a statement, Wiltshire Police told us that Dr. Hoskins was commissioned to provide a confidential report on one small element of the overall inquiry. He only had access to a small number of documents. The statement continues the report provided by Dr. Hoskins forms part of a live ongoing investigation, so the disclosure of this information is something which Wiltshire Police takes very seriously. We did ask them for an interview, but they declined.
You can listen to more free content from the Today programme by